The CDC has just released a new report, I have it right here in my hands, detailing a massive viral outbreak on a cruise ship which was traveling from the United States over to Bermuda. In their official release, the CDC wrote that 177 people aboard a cruise ship called the Celebrity Summit became sick with what's known as the Norovirus. According to the breakdown, 152 passengers, alongside 25 crew members, began to experience symptoms of diarrhea, abdominal cramps, vomiting, and headaches, all of which are symptoms of this norovirus. Furthermore, this is the 12th time this year that the CDC has reported an outbreak of gastrointestinal illnesses on board cruise ships. As you can see up on your screen, out of the 12 reported ships thus far this year, 10 of them were discovered to be infected with this norovirus. Now, once the passengers on board the Celebrity Summit began to get sick one after the other, the cruise line took a number of steps to try and mitigate the situation, including disinfecting the common areas, as well as, funny enough, collecting the stool samples of the passengers in order to send them to a CDC laboratory for testing. I bet that's not exactly what people assumed they were signing up for when they and their family bought cruise tickets. Regardless, setting that aside, in terms of what the norovirus actually is, the symptoms of it are very similar to those of a typical stomach flu. Here's how the CDC describes it. Quote, symptoms include forgetting to smash those like and subscribe buttons below this video. Now, I am, of course, just joking about that. However, if you would like to help expose what the WHO is doing to consolidate their global pandemic power, which is something that we'll get to in a moment, well, I do hope you take a moment to smash those like and subscribe buttons, because that forces the YouTube algorithm to share this episode out to ever more people. Now, here's what the CDC actually wrote in this document regarding the norovirus. Quote, norovirus is a highly contagious stomach bug that often spreads in healthcare facilities, long-term care facilities, restaurants, childcare centers, schools, and cruises. It can spread via contaminated water, food, surfaces, or direct contact with an infected individual, while infection usually starts between 24 and 48 hours of exposure, lasting up to 3 days. In a normal year, norovirus causes between 19 and 21 million cases of vomiting and diarrhea, 109,000 hospitalizations, and 900 deaths across the United States. The virus also is associated with about 495,000 emergency department visits, mostly in younger children. If there is a new strain of the virus, there can be upwards of 50% more norovirus illnesses. And so, within the context of a cruise ship, with those closed quarters and everyone basically on top of each other, the norovirus can spread fairly rapidly. However, it is really worth mentioning that in general, for healthy individuals, this is not much to worry about, no more than worrying about, let's say, the common cold or the seasonal flu. However, let me remind you of the famous words from President Barack Obama's chief of staff. Quote, you never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that is it's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before. And along that exact line, what is truly worrying is not the virus itself, but rather what the WHO is currently up to in order to protect us. That's because it was just announced that the WHO is calling for a global quote-unquote simulation to prep the world for the next global health crisis, whatever that might happen to be. However, in order to explain to you what the simulation talk is all about, I need to back up for a quick moment and explain exactly what the WHO has been up to behind the scenes over the past year. You see, right now, behind closed doors over in Geneva, Switzerland, 194 different countries are working to draft a comprehensive pandemic agreement which would give the WHO, the World Health Organization, substantially more power to deal with global pandemics. Meaning that as you and I speak, both the Biden administration, as well as almost every other country that belongs to the United Nations, is currently in the process of finalizing a deal which would give the World Health Organization massive authority to essentially dictate global pandemic-related policies. And so while the WHO has up until now been essentially an advisory body somewhere over in Europe that US officials in the CDC and FDA turn to for advice, they will instead become the ones to actually determine what policies are implemented. Things like our vaccine policies, our lockdown policies, our school closure policies, the contact tracing of American citizens, and even the monitoring of our online speech, if that speech happens to go against the official narrative. And even though these discussions are happening behind closed doors, we occasionally get a glimpse into what is actually being said and what's actually being negotiated on. For instance, back in February of this year, something called the Zero Draft of their pandemic treaty was made public. You can see it up on your screen. This draft document was the culmination of several months' worth of negotiations. And if you read it, well, you quickly realize that it would give massive amounts of power to the UN through the WHO. For instance, under a subsection that's titled The World Together Equitably, the zero draft document would grant the WHO the power to declare and to manage a global pandemic emergency. Essentially, what this would look like in practice is that when a health emergency is declared by the WHO, whether it's the Norovirus or COVID-23, COVID-24, or COVID-25, the signatories to this agreement, which would include the United States, would submit themselves to the authority of the WHO regarding things like treatments, government regulations such as lockdowns and vaccine mandates. The WHO would take over global supply chains, and they would have the authority to monitor and surveil the populations of the different countries. Basically, if you think back to the COVID pandemic years, what was happening regionally in different countries and different states that enacted things like vaccine mandates, vaccine passports, tracking software, and so on, well, that would all be now done globally at the very same time and managed by exactly one global entity, the WHO. Just imagine the absolute efficiency of it all. Now, this zero draft version of the treaty has not yet been finalized. This was just the first draft, and after it was released to the public, the different countries, they went back to Geneva to continue negotiating it further. And so that is the general backstory here. The 194 members of the United Nations are currently in the process of negotiating a WHO global pandemic treaty behind closed doors in Switzerland. And just for your reference, these negotiations will most likely continue to stay behind closed doors, given the fact that in April of this year, so just 2.5 months ago, quote, delegates from the United States agreed with a Chinese proposal that new international health regulation drafts would not be shared with the public. Nothing like a little Chinese communist secrecy to put a veil on what's really happening behind the scenes. As they say, democracy dies in darkness. Regardless, despite the fact that these negotiations are steamrolling ahead, well, there are still people at the very highest level of the global governing bodies that believe it's taking too long. For instance, there is the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, otherwise known as the GPMB. This was a group that was created by the WHO, and here's how their website describes what they're all about. Quote, the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board is an independent monitoring and accountability body to ensure preparedness for global health crises. Co-convened by the Director General of the World Health Organization and the President of the World Bank, the GPMB is tasked with providing an independent and comprehensive appraisal for policymakers and the world about progress towards increased preparedness and response capacity for disease outbreaks and other emergencies with health consequences. In short, the work of the GPMB is to chart a roadmap for a safer world. All right, I wanted to take a super quick moment and introduce the sponsor of today's episode, the one, the only, My Patriot Supply, America's most trusted preparedness company. Look, when the invariable food shortages hit America and everybody is quite literally forced to eat these quote-unquote earth chips, which for your reference are made with some delicious cricket powder, listen, you don't want to be eating this. Instead, you want to stock up today on emergency food for when the invariable stuff hits the fan. And so head on over to mypatriotsupply.com and buy their 3-month emergency food kits, because those food kits, they will provide you and your family with 2,000 calories per day right when you need it the most. And they'll come in the form of breakfasts, lunches, dinners, as well as snacks that can last in your cupboard for up to 25 years. They are shipped quickly and discreetly directly to your doorstep. And best of all, for our viewers, for the viewers of Facts Matter, My Patriot Supply is throwing in an awesome bonus. $200 worth of survival gear that they'll throw in with your order. If you want to see the full list of the gear, you can head on over to their website. It'll be down in the description box below, or you can just head on over to mypatriotsupply.com. And so again, as I always say, pray for the best, but prepare for the worst. Head on over to mypatriotsupply.com and stock up on your emergency food today. Now let's head on back to the studio. And it was exactly this small group, convened jointly by the WHO and the World Bank, which just went ahead and called for a global pandemic simulation to take place. Here's what the co-chair of the GPMB wrote in a public statement. Quote, we feel very strongly that we cannot wait for the next emergency to find out how well the pandemic accord and the international health regulation amendments will work. We need to know now. We therefore suggest that member states, together with other key stakeholders, carry out a simulation exercise based on the draft accord and the draft international health regulation amendments later this year, before they are finalized and adopted. And if this all sounds familiar to you, if you're suddenly getting a case of deja vu, well, that might be because this group, the GPMB, they were exactly the group who back in September of 2019 released a report which, quote, predicted a respiratory pandemic would cause millions of deaths and immense damage to the world economy. That's right. In their report, which again was released in September of 2019, just 3 months before the first case of COVID was found out in Wuhan, China, well, here's what they wrote, quote, the world is at acute risk for devastating regional or global disease epidemics or pandemics that not only cause loss of life, but upend economies and create social chaos. And these words prove to be rather prescient, because wouldn't you know it, this report was published in September of 2019. Then, just 3 short months later, in December of 2019, a local scientist over in Wuhan, China, happened to identify a mysterious pneumonia-like illness. And then, just 4 months later, in March of 2020, well, the WHO declared a pandemic from what is now known as COVID-19. Meaning that if this group gets their wish, and if they're able to conduct a global pandemic simulation exercise sometime later this year, well, let's go ahead and pay attention to their findings, because there's a good chance they might know something that we don't. If you'd like to go through any of the research from today's episode, including the zero draft document of that WHO pandemic treaty, all that will be down in the description box below this video for your perusal. And now lastly, over on Epoch TV, which is our awesome no censorship video platform, I just published a phenomenal episode detailing what you can call a bombshell that the CDC just dropped on those who have taken the vaccine. Specifically, what happened was that about a month ago, there was a conference held for staff members of the CDC over at a hotel in Atlanta, Georgia. And on the very last day of the conference, well, something unusual happened. Several of the people in attendance notified the event organizers that they had tested positive for COVID-19. An investigation was then conducted, and it was found that, for one, this CDC conference had turned into a super spreader event with over 12% of the CDC staff members getting COVID. But even more shocking, every single person that got COVID at that event had already received the shots. Now, that story actually gets a lot deeper. So if you'd like to check it out, the link will be right there at the very top of the description box below. Unfortunately, I cannot publish it here on this platform due to issues of censorship, but over on Epoch TV, our awesome no censorship video platform, we can publish it without any problems. And so again, that episode's link will be right there at the very top of the description box below. Just click on that link and you can head on over to Epoch TV and watch it without delay. And then until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed and most importantly, stay free.